button I didn't click was go live.
Go live, yes. You need to click on go live.
Okay.
Okay, now it's in live now.
Mhm.
I think I can
Where is the
see.
YouTube link, Silen? I just want to check whether in the announcement is exactly same or not.
Yeah, I think the YouTube link is different, lah. Okay,
Yeah.
okay, it's live now. Same, it's the same.
Same. LJQ. Okay, now we can give.
Okay, Stella. You can. I end the remote section, huh?
UN. Okay, UN. Yeah. Thank you, Silen. Okay,
Okay.
now I'm giving Alessandro presenter role. Alessandro, can share the screen now.
Hi everyone. Hi Alessandro, how are you?
Hey, good. Shafat,
Nice
do you
to
hear
meet-
me?
Nice to see you.
I hear a strange return. Ah,
Can you hear me?
yes, I can. But I also can hear myself in a weird way. But anyway, so can you see the slides?
Yeah, it looks good to me.
Very good. So I didn't realize, Shafat, one thing, that you are George's student who is working on these future trade policy things with the thing, and in a different project. I am one of the first quoting you, in fact.
I see. Yeah, George is doing a lot of good work on expectation of future policy changes, and I think so. He's done some work with Carter on this Carter mix,
Yes,
and
but
so we also have a project where we are trying to estimate the degree of trade policy uncertainty.
yeah, no, I saw
Yeah.
that. But I'm also referring with your paper, with your, I guess, friend and classmate or something like that, which I really liked, and in fact, I for a different paper I used this projected path of very disaggregated HS6, tariffs. In my case, I used the Canada-Korea free trade agreement. But I came across your paper as one of the few papers using this, projected reduction in tariff schedules, right? So where are you based now?
So yeah, so I'm right now. I'm telecommuting, but I'm usually in Kuala Lumpur. Right now, I'm working from my home country, Pakistan. So
Oh, you're
that's
in
where I
Pakistan
am
now.
these days. Yeah.
I see. Very
So I'll
nice.
be back at the end of this month.
At the end of the month, you'll be back to Kuala Lumpur.
Yeah.
Very good.
I just have one question about so I'll be introducing you, but so your institution, is
Yes.
there a, how do you pronounce it? Could you call it UQAM or something like
UQAM,
that? Or
absolutely. UQAM is perfect.
UQAM. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you ever been to Montreal?
No, I haven't. The closest I've been is to
Toronto.
Ottawa.
Ottawa. Well, Montreal is much better than Ottawa. Oh, we are live. I shouldn't say these things, actually. The capital is great, but and how is the vaccination effort going in those areas of the world? For instance, in Pakistan, is there a lot of people already with the vaccine, or really not yet?
So we're I think we're trying to vaccinate more and more, but I mean it's not as good as
The developed world, huh?
Malaysia has really picked up the pace. I think now they have around 50% people fully vaccinated.
But
So
Pakistan
Malaysia
instead,
is doing really good.
Pakistan a little bit less.
Yeah, I think it's close to 20% now.
I see.
So not so good actually, especially since we keep hearing about these new variants and other things of concern. But I think, yeah, I mean, it's just unfortunate what's going on, and in expectation, it seems like things are going to stay like this for some time now.
I see.
Where are you in? Where are you right now?
I'm in Canada. You remember we discussed the opportunity of doing it on June, and since I spent the summer in Italy, that was not ideal.
I see.
Because that would have been, 9 p.m. is okay. You can do it, but 4 a.m. I already had kindly enough, all the summer conferences in Asia were obviously taking their schedule on the base of the affiliations, right? Obviously so. But since I was in Italy, I had so many conferences at 4 a.m. For China, because they were putting the presentation at 10 a.m., thinking that it was 10 p.m. for me, but it was actually 4 a.m. So I have these experiences of getting up in the middle of the night and present a paper, which was kind of a new thing to me, certainly new thing.
I think it's one. Yeah, you cannot right now. You cannot predict someone's location based on their affiliation.
No, exactly, and so it's quite funny, that. But anyway, so it's we're going to see. So I guess you don't have a lot of audience from Europe at this series.
Yeah, that's a concern, but I think the idea is that this seminar series is jointly advertised by the main research group in DC. So what we try to do is get participants from the East Coast at least.
Yeah, but I guess 9 p.m. is not really easy enough for them. People have families, it's not the ideal Wednesday night listening to a paper.
Yeah, absolutely. I think 12 hours is a big challenge. Yeah.
Paradoxically, it's better than. Yeah, no, you're right. It's a big challenge. Have you ever? So you work with co-author in North America. So you have these 12 hours.
Yeah.
So you wake up very early in the morning or go to sleep very late at night?
I usually sleep late because all my co-authors are super efficient with their timing. So they wake up at. So we've had meetings starting at 7 a.m. Eastern time. So they prefer that. So then it's not that big of a problem for me when I'm in Kuala Lumpur. But when I'm in Pakistan, so Pakistan is 9 hours ahead. So that's even better because I don't have to even work after 6 sometimes.
No, but wait, then for you it's very early now. What time is it?
Right now it is, yes, but I think that's it's just it's 6 a.m. but it's not that early. I think this is what I aim for.
To start the seminars at 6 a.m.
To start working. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, Shafat.
Yeah.
Yeah, Shafat. I actually jabber you the survey link.
Yeah.
I will also put in this chat. So everything is okay. We just wait for 9 o'clock to start. Yeah, I will start recording at 9.
Okay. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I see. So 6 a.m. Early wake up. I'm sorry. We should have done it in October so that you would be at least at 9 a.m.
No, I'm glad that we're able to do this. I really don't mind. Actually, so I'll be traveling to Kuala Lumpur in a couple of weeks, so it's a good practice for me, good adjustment
see.
for my time zone. Yeah.
In which city are you staying now? In Karachi, Islamabad?
I'm in Karachi, yes.
Karachi, I see. Actually, there is a BC PhD student before even my generation, for maybe graduate of 2009 or 10, that was working in Pakistan. Farouk, I don't remember his name. I believe he was working at the central bank.
Oh, right. So I don't know him exactly because I think he has left. Because I have a friend at Central Bank, but I think you're talking about Farooq Pasha.
Yes,
Right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I believe he was my TA for some course at BC or something. Yeah.
Ah, I see. Wow, that's good.
Yeah. So say hi
I've
to
heard
him.
very good things about him.
So
I've heard
if
great
you,
things about him, but I think he's left now.
I see. So if you ever cross his path, since you are, same country, just say hi on my behalf.
Absolutely. So this is our first seminar of the season. So let me give like a couple of minutes before we can start. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Hmm.
I mean, I honestly have the sense that a good paper should be presented in 15 minutes. So we have 1 hour. It's more than enough.
Right, we have 45 minutes of we can have 45 minutes of questions and answers then.
Yeah, no, like it's okay. I mean, but I do think that within the first 15 minutes, either you understood everything or it's the problem in a certain sense. Not in the details, but at least the punchline, should be clear.
Yeah.
I'll try to do that. Let me try, Shafat, one thing. So I want to close everything. Can you try to talk?
Yeah.
Okay, so
But
because
me? You're asking
yeah,
me
perfect.
or
So
okay.
I understand now, because I cannot keep all the windows open in front of me. I also need to see the
Right,
slides,
yeah.
and so I see that you have this system that essentially, if I close everything, it tells me who's speaking.
Ah, okay. Right, I see. You just see the name of the person speaking?
Exactly, which is very nice. Yes,
I see.
because I mean, I want to be able to keep track, of the chat. So it's great that everybody jumps in whenever they want, and that's it. So
let me begin the seminar series. I think we have a critical mass of people. Hi everyone, welcome to the seminar series, the first seminar of this season. Welcome to our series at the World Bank Research Center in Kuala Lumpur. Today we have a very distinguished speaker, Alessandro Barattieri at UQAM. He'll be presenting his very insightful, very interesting work on the effects of trade policy that runs through production networks, and he'll be focusing on a very, very widely used trade policy instrument in this paper. So logistical issues, the talk is going to be around 45 minutes, which will be followed by a Q&A session. So if you have any clarifying questions, you can send it to me during the talk via chat. and I can ask them at the opportune time. But if you and then you can if there are detailed questions, then it can also be delayed until the end. But with this, let me give the virtual floor to Alessandro. Alessandro, please begin at your convenience. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Shafat, and so thank you everyone for being here. Good morning or good night, good evening, according to who you're where you're based. My name is Alessandro. I'm going to present this paper jointly with Matteo Cacciatore from HSC Montreal. Self-harming trade policy, protections, and production networks. Let me say that if you want to jump in a normal style, for me it's not at all a problem, but otherwise we'll follow the rules set by the host. So if we think at the pre-COVID world, the biggest elephant in the room in any discussion was clearly the trade war and the trade tensions. And so we all remember that in 2018, the US imposed new tariff on roughly 12% of its imports, and particularly hitting heavily the global supply chains. Now, something interesting is that protectionism on intermediate inputs is not at all new. And in fact, since at least the 1990s, governments have used the temporary trade barriers, TTBs for the presentation, to restrict the trade mostly in intermediate inputs. When we talk about TTBs, we mostly think about anti-dumping, countervailing duties, and safeguards. Now, it's not surprising that this background, supply chains consideration are very prominent in policy discussions. In particular, you have on the one side, industry which ask for protection, typical example with the steel industry, versus sectors that use this output of protected industry as inputs. And so, given the importance of these policy discussions, or you can read also in the press a lot of this discussion, it's surprising that there is not really a lot of systematic evidence on the effects of protectionism through vertical production linkages. And so what we do in this paper is exactly to take a first stab at this by estimating the dynamic effect of protectionism through vertical production linkages. One key contribution of our paper is to identify trade policy shocks using monthly disaggregated US data on TTBs from 1994 to 2015. And we'll spend a lot of time, of course, on this identification, which is made possible by some institutional features of these TTBs, which we will discuss very soon. We are able, once we identify trade policy shocks for the certain key industries, to construct measure of upstream protectionism facing all manufacturing industry by using disaggregated IO tables. So we are talking about the 4-digit NIX industry classification. Second contribution, we estimate this dynamic response of employment to protectionism both within industries and across industries using panel local projections, which is a tool which has been extensively used now in macroeconomics for fiscal policy, monetary policy, and we apply these to trade policy. Finally, we inspect the mechanisms and the quantitative implication of our results. In particular, we analyze the response of input and output prices in the downstream industry. By downstream, I mean the industry that use heavily as intermediate input these output of industry which are protected by TTBs. Then we'll investigate also the response of the stock market in downstream industries. Here we'll move from monthly to daily data. And finally, we'll also look at the aggregate employment effects of TTBs. Now, if you need to run somewhere else or it's late at night, you want to watch US Open, this is the slide to remember. This is also a thing I will ask you in a week. What do you remember from Alessandro's seminar? So this is the key findings of our efforts. So first, we find only small, short-lived, and mostly insignificant beneficial employment effects in the industry protected by TTBs. However, we find negative, persistent, and statistically significant effect on employment in downstream industries, which means the industries that use protected industry as intermediate input. In terms of the mechanism and the quantitative implication, we find mostly three things. So the first is that we do observe, following protection, an increase in both intermediate input and final producer price. So the story seems to be quite intuitively a story of loss of competitiveness in downstream industry driving employment losses. Secondly, we do find the stock market returns decline within a few days of delay of the announcements of these TTBs. And third, we find that aggregate employment effect of these TTBs are small on average, but can be sizable in large TTB episodes. In terms of the related literature, we connect to several strands of the literature. There is a newly rising literature starting, of course, on the trade war and its effect on import prices, welfare. Keep in mind that these are analyzing one episode, and the implicit assumption is that was exogenous, right? So our main contribution is to provide a way to identify exogenous trade policy shocks conditional on data that we can observe for 20 years. Then there is a trade policy and vertical production linkage literature. We also connect to the literature on the effects of protections on aggregate outcomes, where we also have a recent contribution in the JIE. And finally, we speak to the long-run productivity effects of trade liberalization for the way in which we organize our material. So what will happen in the next 35 minutes? I will talk about the data. I will talk about the identification of trade policy shocks, then the panel local projections, economic mechanism and quantitative implications, robustness, and conclusions. So now let me pause a second just to ask if there are, as of now, any clarifying questions. Seems not. So we can move on. TTBs and data. So let me start off by saying why TTBs are actually a wonderful laboratory to study the effect of protectionism. So first, and especially the protections through input-output linkages. So first, these are the predominant contingent trade policy instrument for WTO members, which means beyond this decline in the final goods tariff, the MFN tariffs, which are declining secularly, we have a lot of action in these TTBs, as you will see in a few minutes. Second, they are heavily used in key upstream industries, such as chemicals, plastic and rubber, base metals, etc., which gives us an empirically relevant measure of upstream protectionism. Third, tariffs which are imposed are very high, 10 to 20 times higher than MFN tariff. Fourth, they are coming at the very disaggregated level, this data, which allow us a more accurate measure of input-output linkages. And finally, they come at high frequency. And this will allow us to exploit a short-run restriction in order to identify the dynamic effect of protectionism. In the US, the US Tariff Act... Yes.
May I interrupt? There's a question in the chat about...
Oh, sorry, I don't see the chat. Yes, sorry.
No, that's fine. I can monitor that. So the question is by Somesh, and the question is that, are these downstream upstream industries forward and backward linkages of the global value chains, or are these domestic linkages?
These are domestic linkages, but of course, this is also, the question is correct. So like, this would lead to higher prices, lower welfare, lower employment. So let me say why these TTBs are key. Because there is this regulation-induced decision lag. So essentially, the idea is that once we're talking about the anti-dumping, for instance, the opening of an anti-dumping investigation takes more than 1 month. Why is that? Because producers need to gather evidence about the dumped imports. The petition that are presented to the SOITC must represent at least 25% of products' domestic total production. So this involves coordination efforts. And there is the need for the US ITC to assess the compliance of the petitioners. So all of this creates a lag, which ultimately will allow us to assume that these TTBs, we will not respond to the realization of our variable of interest, which is employment, within the same month, which is a very reasonable assumption. Second, the opening of an investigation is publicly announced so that agents can have access to the supporting evidence. And so therefore, we focus on the investigations rather than on their final outcomes to avoid some sort of anticipation effects. And finally, investigation typically results, as I said before, in large, long-lasting and potentially retroactive tariffs. Now, this is the good news. I'm very glad I'm presenting here because, in fact, this work was made possible by the World Bank in a certain sense. Shutdown and others maintain this temporary trade barriers database. And so we use that and we match the date of each investigation to the number of HS6-digit products covered by each investigation, and we can then construct monthly industry level time series from 1994 to 2015, aggregating them, as I said, at the 4-digit industry level using the Pearson-Schott conversion table. Here, a first table, which I think is useful in that it shows you how few industries are very important for these TTBs. In fact, these 8 industries account for roughly 70% of all TTBs action in the US. And as you can see, these industries are iron, basic chemical, fabricated metal, resin, rubber, so are industries which are relatively upstream in the production network of the US. What is interesting of this table is to see that, you know, in the vast majority of cases, this investigation ends up in tariffs. The third column shows you the median tariff, which is very high. The fourth column shows you how, on average, these measures affect a modest share of the sectoral import. But fifth column, there are episodes in which this share is very substantial, right? Up to 30% or 20% of the sectoral input. Lastly, these sectors are quite open ones in terms of the ratio of imports to output. So on the one side, we have a few industries which are the lion's share of the activity. The good news is that these few industries are important ones from our perspective. So from our perspective, these industries, so this is a snapshot of this is a snapshot of the US production networks in 2007. And I don't know. Sorry, I have a small thing on my screen. Do you see also this meeting is being streamed live, or I have something that I cannot make this appear?
No, I think at our end it's fine.
Okay, then I can go on. Okay, it's good now. Sorry, I had like the screen covered by other stuff. Okay, so as you can see, the blue dots are our industries. The size of the dot is the importance of this industry as an intermediate input for the manufacturing sector. A cleanest way to see this non-graphical is with numbers. So as you can see, our 8 industries account for 12% of manufacturing production. But once we start considering how important they are for as intermediate inputs, you see that this number rockets up. And what is this? So in particular, the difference here between the second and the third column is the difference between what is called direct requirement. So how much of an industry is needed by another industry for an output, for $1 of output directly. And this is one thing. But what we are interested in is what is called the total requirement. So the typical example is the steel and its usage on motor vehicles, right? So you have some steel which is directly used from motor vehicle, but some steel that is used from motor vehicles indirectly because it's used in the production of engines, right? So the total requirement table is the ones that account for all these indirect requirements as well. And so this is where we are at the fourth column, where you see that these 8 industries on average accounts for 1/5 of the intermediate inputs used by the average manufacturing sector. So the bad news, few industries, the very good news, very important industries. How do we measure? So which is our baseline measure of TTB protection? Our baseline measure of TTB protection is the share of the sectoral imports affected by new TTBs in a given month. So there is a dummy variable equal to 1 if the imports of product J from country K is subject to a new investigation at time T. And then we multiply that dummy by the average bilateral sector I import share for product J from country K in the previous years. Let me do an example that makes things very clear. Iron, steel, and ferroalloy in November 2000 has investigation on 27 imported products from 11 countries. This involved 3.7% of the 1999 sectoral imports of iron and steel for the US. Our measure for that month is 3.7%. We use previous year weights. Of course, we have a lot of robustness using average weights, using only the extensive marginal variation. So robustness is going to be really pervasive. But this is a great starting point, which gives you this picture. This picture I really would like you to see very carefully. So because it tells you a lot of the story. So on one side, you have 4 of these 8 industries, you have 2 things. So the blue bars are our measure. So this is in terms of the sectoral imports, right? So how much of the sectoral imports is affected by new TTBs in a given month. And as you can see, on average, this could be small, but there are cases in which these are substantial. We overimpose on that a simple thing, which is the growth rate of employment in that industry. It seems the same, but actually is the industry-specific one. So they're very correlated, of course, because of some aggregate stuff, but you know. And now you see immediately that there are some cases in which you have initiatives that are taking place in moments in which employment is growing above the mean, but there are many cases in which employment is falling just before the initiative. And so here you see clearly that the key challenge is to disentangle which part of this protectionism is actually an endogenous outcome of relevant economic fundamentals, and which part instead could be considered an exogenous shock and thence used to gauge causal effect. So the key to our effort is to identify the shocks from this series. And how do we do that? So our econometric approach takes a 2-stage estimation approach, which we borrow from macroeconomics. So the first one is to identify movements in these TTBs which are plausibly free of endogenous and anticipatory movement relative to the outcomes variable of interest, which in our case is mostly employment and as well prices. So once we are able to identify these movements who are free of endogenous and anticipatory movement, then we can use these shocks, which will be shocks, to estimate the dynamic response of industry employment and prices to protectionism, and we will do it using local projections. Again, let me stop a second to ask, so the chat is okay, still empty.
Sorry,
so...
I just have a question. So
Yep.
you're focusing on 8 upstream industries.
Correct.
Is there a reason why you're focusing on these particular industries?
So
Yeah.
the reason is that is visible from here, that once you go below, so say that you have some industries where you have 1 episode, then for the reason that will be very clear in 2 minutes, it's very challenging to identify the shocks in that episode. You need a lot of variation to be able to identify the shocks. And that's why we take, if we could expand, right? Clearly, these are the 8 industries that are the bulk of the thing. So like, you know, we can expand to more than 8. Like we picked 8 out of the beauty of having 4 and 4 pictures. So it could be 10, but you know, you wouldn't add much. But the problem is that if you go way below, then it becomes very challenging to be able to identify the shocks.
I see.
And you'll see why. So how do we identify these shocks? So we identify these shocks borrowing a consolidating identification strategy from macro, in particular Romer and Romer, talking about monetary policy. And the idea is to purge from the movements of these TTBs, the movements which are endogenous to employment, past, current, and expected future employment, thus reaching what we call the conditional exogeneity, so that our shocks are conditional exogenous to employment. We'll use 2 methods. One is our baseline, which is a time series approach, and then as robustness, we use a panel approach. In both cases, what is key to understand is that purging the identification assumption is a short-run restriction that, because of the institutional feature induced delays that I explained to you before, we assume that the TTBs cannot respond to current realization of the shock. And this is because even if something happens, the firms still need to gather together, put on the evidence, and ask the protection to the authorities, right? So the within-month response is assumed to be 0. And then, of course, what is left to control is the dependence of these TTBs on past realizations of employment and other stuff, and on expected future realization. This last part will be the one that will take us a lot of work. So because we are dealing with shares, I remind you our baseline measure, we have, of course, as I said, a lot of robustness, but our baseline measure is the share of imports subject to new TTBs. We use in our time series approach, which means an approach which cleans by this series industry by industry, a fractional response model, which is to say we model these protectionist measures as a part which is due to economic fundamental and a part which instead is not explained by economic fundamental, which will be our shock of interest. So what is the part which we explain with economic fundamentals? What are the economic fundamentals that we consider? Well, we consider something simple, which is the past growth of employment in the industry and the past growth of employment in downstream industries. We also can easily control for aggregate expectations in using the survey of professional forecasters, for instance. What is actually a little bit more tricky is how to get to some sort of industry level expectation measure. And there, what we do is we rely on stock market data. So now we move essentially to firm level data from Compustat merged with CRISP, and we built what is a median market to book ratio for the industry, and also a market to book ratio for the downstream industries. Let me explain the market to book ratio. The market to book ratio includes information on expected future return. The simple idea is that the market to book ratio of a given firm is its market capitalization divided by the equity book value. So if this measure is above 1, this means that the investors are willing to pay more than the net assets are worth, which, if we believe that the stock market entails some form of expectation about future profitability of a firm, would tell us that there is the expectation of healthy future profits. The contrary, of course, if this market to book is below 1, or in general, the movements of the market to book should reflect somehow also the movements of the expectation about future profitability. In order to check that this variable effectively has some sort of forecasting power, we do run a Granger causality test. So we check whether the future employment growth in the industries can be captured somehow by the market to book. And we do find evidence for that. So this is like considering the entire manufacturing sector, the median market, you see that the past realization of the median market to book have forecasting power for future employment growth. So this tells us that we can use this measure as somehow a way of capturing expectation at the industry level, which is obviously something which is very difficult to do. Moreover, for the most important of our firms, we do something even more, and we show how, you see, this is the measure of the median market to book of the listed firm in the iron and steel sector, and you see the variation, right? So there are moments in which it seems to go up a lot above 1, some moments where it's below 1. And we show that the blue line is very close to a line which is the dotted red line, which is much more difficult to build because that is actually the median market to book specific to petitioners. So here what we had to do was to go in each investigation and look exactly at which were the firms that were petitioning. We matched by name with Compustat and CRISP, and then we computed the market to book which was specific to the petitioner. So by this picture, what we want to convey is the idea that effectively this measure does capture some measure of the expectation of the profitability that is relevant for the petitioning. And all of this, again, why? I remind you, because the idea is to purge our series of protectionism from what is the dependent from present, past, and future expected outcome of the variable of interest, which for us is employment. As alternative approach, instead of running these regressions, again, industry by industry, what we do is exploiting the panel dimension of the data. So for these 8 industries, we can run a regression where we have industry and time fixed effect. This allows, of course, to remove the constant unobserved heterogeneity across industries and common aggregate shocks. So here would be a simple panel regression. Again, the idea is that what we are interested is these residuals, right? Are these shocks? And we don't want to consider this part, because this part would be the endogenous response of protectionists to economic fundamental or expectation of them. Notice, however, that this second approach with the fixed effect potentially removes variation in the protectionism, which is unrelated to economic outcomes, which we would like to keep. So in a certain sense, that's why it's not the same level for us, because this fixed effect might remove too much, paradoxically, to the series. So a question that you might have is that, okay, but then if you take out all the variation which is due to economic fundamental, what is left in the error term? And so the error terms, you need to think about this in two ways. So the first is purely statistical. So is something which gives us the conditional exogeneity, which is sufficient to identify causal effect on employment. But this is like a finance argument, which probably is not very familiar to many people. Luckily, the people that study in details the TTBs explored this and told us that, in fact, there are a lot of non-economic determinants of TTBs. In particular, there is the potentiality of lobbying to affect domestic market structure and export. There might be political factors. We found a very interesting case about the TTBs against Brazil, which was clearly politically motivated in 2002. It could be retaliation against foreign protectionism. It could be strategies to coordinate and support collusive behavior. In sum, it could be many things, but the important aspect is that these things are not determined by our outcome variable of interest, which is employment. Here is the second key picture for you to visualize. So once we run this regression, this is the time series regression, you can see that our model is able to capture, so the economic determinants effectively capture quite a bit of the dynamics of these TTBs. And honestly, nicely so, especially, for instance, during the recession, you see that the predicted values, so the TTBs, which would be the endogenous response to the economic fundamental, can explain a large portion of these TTBs spikes, of these TTBs episodes. But there are other instances in which instead they don't seem to be that important, okay? And so the difference between these raw series and the predicted series will be precisely the shocks that we will have at our disposal to identify the protectionist effect on the protected industry employment. How do we pass from here to the upstream protectionism? Now that is simple, because once we have the shock at each industry, and so sorry, and these are good shocks. So we check that they are not autocorrelated. We check that on average is a sort of 50-50. So like 50% is explained by the economic model and 50% is explained by the non-economic factors. Once we have this shock, we combine these identified structural shock with detailed information from IO matrices, and we can compute a measure of upstream protections as the weighted average of the shocks across these 8 industries for each of the 70 industries in the manufacturing sector. We use the fixed weights, and the weights reflect the contribution of the industry J to output in industry I. We use total requirement, as I said before. So now we are armed with 8 shocks for the 8 industries which are the most heavy users of these TTBs, and we have 70 upstream shocks for the other 70 industry, for all the 70s industry in the manufacturing sector. What do we do with these shocks? We run panel local projections. So what are panel local projections? Panel local projections are a very popular tool whereby essentially we run H-step ahead predictive panel regressions. So we run a regression for each of 30 horizons. And in each regression, we run, so in the own industry is going to be the panel of the 8 industries for which we have the identified shocks, epsilon IT. And our object of interest is going to be the sequence of coefficient gamma H, one for each horizon, which will give us the impact of protectionism on the own industries, on the protected industry employment at horizon H, after controlling, of course, because we are in a panel regression, setting for industry and time fixed effects. Instead, in order to explore the causal effect of protectionism, of upstream protectionism on downstream employment, what we will run is a panel of local projections where we will consider the cumulative employment difference for the downstream industries, and we regress that on this upstream protectionist shock, which we will call epsilon IO. So gamma HIO will be the series of coefficients which we are interested in because they will trace the dynamic response of employment in downstream industries to an upstream protectionist shock at time t. Again, because we are in the panel regression context, we can add, of course, industry and time fixed effect as well. There are several advantages of using these over, say, a VAR or a panel VAR. For instance, this method, which was popularized by Jordan in 2005, does not impose potential inappropriate dynamic restrictions and is robust to any type of misspecification. Also, it accommodates nonlinearities. So now you're ready for the key result, the first main results of the paper. And here it is. So what we are showing you now is a sequence of coefficients. So again, this is horizon by horizon is the coefficient from the panel regression with its bootstrap standard error, following a shock which we size as a 1% increase in the share of imports subject to new TTBs. The panel on top report the response of employment in the own industry, in the protected industries. And as I announced at the beginning of the seminar, we don't find at all an employment response in these industries, which after us, we have 3 papers doing these type of things, is a common result. However, in the downstream industry, bottom panel, we do see a decline which is persistent, which is sizable, and which is highly statistically significant in the employment on average of the downstream industries. So to respond, for those of you who are more into the policy world, Peter Navarro was asked once about this downstream effect, and he claimed the downstream effect is fake news. In the sense, this picture is saying Peter Navarro is fake news, because actually we do find a relevant sizable downstream effect. If we use the other approach in identifying our shocks, while the result is qualitatively similar, quantitatively slightly different, but as you can see, again, we do see no effect on the employment of the own industry and negative, significant, and persistent effect on downstream industries. Let me pause a second to see whether there are questions or comments or problems. The chat is still empty. Okay. So just to give you a sense, we tried hard to give also a quantitative sense to these estimates. And in order to do that, we mapped our shocks into a corresponding sectoral uniform tariff variation. So the uniform tariff would be essentially the tariff that would be equivalent once applied to the whole sector to the one that we observe with the TTBs, which is only applied to a small subset of imports in the sector. And then we can construct with following each initiative, and so also the withdrawal of this initiative over time. I didn't have the time to explain this. This can be read in the paper in detail. And we can then estimate what we call a uniform tariff elasticity to the share of imports subject to new TTBs, which is our measure, which is equal to roughly 1. So what I showed you before, you can interpret as the impact of a uniform 1% increase in the share in the import tariff, in the uniform import tariff in the 8 upstream industries, which means I showed you that a decline is of the order of 0.15% in the average employment in the average industry. This is after 12 months of an increase of 1% in the uniform import tariff for the 8 upstream industries, which are object of our analysis. I believe I have 7 minutes or 10, perhaps. Can you help me with time? But
Yeah, but you can go, because I was asking questions in the middle, you can go.
okay.
a
So
little bit
now
over
that
as well.
you saw the main, up to now, let's recap. So we identified trade policy shock both in these 8 key industries and in all the downstream industries. We ran panel local projections, and we found no apparent evidence of employment effects in the own industry and important negative effects in the downstream industries. Now, the third part of the paper is about trying to explore economic mechanisms and also quantitative implications. So this paper is mostly about the downstream effects, so the input-output production network stuff. So we do not spend too much time on the absence of beneficial employment effect in protected industries. We plan to do this in the future more. But certainly, we can list some reasons why we might not observe, in fact, a positive employment response. People would ask us all the time, but then why they would do that, right? So a first reason why we might not observe a positive employment response is that we are still looking too high. We are still looking at a level of disaggregation which is too aggregate to detect heterogeneous responses across producers within a given industry. Because of different exposure to TTB, for instance, this would require a firm level analysis, which we are very willing to do, but one paper, one point. A second potential reason is that there are offsetting forces that determine an industry output demand and henceforth labor demand, which is the tension, which we explored in another paper, between expenditure switching and expenditure changing. Potential for a retaliation is another reason that might explain the absence of a positive employment effect. What we are really more interested in, given also the lot of discussion that there was on this absence or presence of downstream effects from protecting some key industries such as steel, is expecting the mechanism that can explain the negative effects which we find in the downstream industries. Now, lower competitiveness seems to be a natural candidate. Now, imagine that there are these TTBs, so downstream producers might not quickly replace inputs subject to these new TTBs and simply end up paying higher prices. Or you can think a situation in which producers actually switch to potentially less efficient domestic supplier, so they still pay higher prices. So these two stories, these two models essentially, would give you different implications, for instance, the dynamics of imports, but would still give you, in both cases, a rise in both marginal costs and prices for the downstream industries. And so it seemed natural to us to explore, once we had these shocks, which are the implications for prices, both input prices and output prices in the downstream industry. And so that's what we do. Here we run into a small data limitation, that is that at this detail level of NACS4 with all the industries we need for, the data from BLS are only available for 2004. And so we use this producer price index and we combine them with input-output coefficients in order to construct for each industry also an intermediate input price index. And once we have these two series, so output price and input price, what we do is simply, again, to use our preferred tool, these local projections, to explore the dynamic impact of now only the upstream protectionism on downstream protectionist input prices, the first of the two formulas, and the downstream industries' output prices, the second formula. Again, as before, our interest will be the series of these coefficients horizon by horizon. And as you can see, quite nicely, we do see an increase in input prices for downstream industries following an upstream shock, which is also reflected then with a certain pass-through into an increase in the output price. Notice also, if you go back to the idea of the employment response, that the peaks of these price responses are actually predating the trough of the employment response, which makes also a nice case for the dynamics, right? That we are allowed to look with this high frequency world, which would not be possible to see if we were to deal with lower frequency data. So loss of competitiveness seems to be like a simple yet compelling reason why we observe this negative downstream effect in the employment effect in the downstream industries. To corroborate our analysis, we then exploit the fact that now we do have shocks for protections. We can use them in many ways. And so, also thanks to a great suggestion of an editor, we start turning to the stock market response. So to gather additional evidence about the declining profitability in downstream industries, what we did was to use stock market data and to compute median daily return using firm level data from CRISP. And once we have this industry level median daily return, we can again run panel local projections now using daily data. So we have now a daily shock. We are lucky because there is never a case in which essentially in one of these 8 industries in a given month you have more than one investigation. So we can exactly pinpoint which is the date in which this investigation is actually opened and announced to the public. And so with that information, which would be the epsilon hat JD, we can compute an epsilon IO ID, which is essentially the daily upstream protection with shock. And we can, of course, control for the aggregate dynamics of the stock market. And again, the series of the coefficient will be the dynamic response, in this case, of the average industry return to an upstream shock in a given day. And here is our result. As you can see, with some delay, now here are business days, right? Within a week, more or less, you do have the stock market reacting to this news. And this is very interesting. So it's like the stock market is effectively anticipating that there will be potentially a loss of employment and profitability in the future in these industries. This delay is actually also consistent with finance literature, which tells us that there are these lags structure in the reaction of returns when there are firms which are linked with IO linkages. So we are also consistent with the finance literature. I want to be a little bit quicker on the last substantive part of the paper, which are the aggregate effects. So I gave you up to now just averages effect, but a relevant question, of course, is what would be the aggregate effect of these TTBs. And in order to address this question, we follow 2 approaches. The first one is to actually augment our baseline downstream local projection regression to include potential spillover effect across industries. I'll be clearer in a second. And then we'll also use simply an aggregate regression. So what would be standard in trade literature, once you have an average employment response estimated, is to interact that with the industry-specific exposure to protections, right? Which depends, of course, on each theta, which is the IO coefficient. And so this could get you a predicted change in employment in a given industry, which you could sum up to get a manufacturing-wide response. This procedure, however, disregards some important aspect, which is the potential spillover of industries to each other, which means that the employment in a given industry could be affected by the exposure to upstream protections, both of its supplier and of its buyers. Now, because we are using the total requirement table, the supplier part is actually taken care of, but the buyer's part is not. And so the way to address this is to actually simply augment our second stage downstream panel local projection by adding a new element capturing a measure of the upstream protections in the buyers of each industry I. And so in this way, we can account for this spillover. Once we do the calculation then of aggregating up all the single industry I predicted change in employment, we can explore effectively the aggregate implication for both the average shocks and what are the main episodes, which is an episode taking place in the steel sector in 2015, where basically almost 10% of the sector was subject to new TTBs. Our result for the aggregate manufacturing employment losses are as follows. If we look at the main episodes, again, give you a sense, 10% increase in the tariff on all steel, this reduces employment in the aggregate manufacturing after 12 months by 0.34%, which would be less if you do not consider this spillover business that I try to explain in 1 minute. However, if you look at the average TTB shocks across TTB episodes, this number is less, reasonably so, and is around 0.15%, 0.11% without considering the spillovers. The second approach to give you a sense of the aggregate magnitude is using simply aggregate data. So we have these sectoral shocks. We estimate an aggregate of this sectoral shock, and we run a panel local projection using aggregate employment and some controls. And if we do that, again, the estimate implies that if we look at the main episode, that would give us a reduction after 12 months of aggregate employment of around 0.29%, whereas if we look at the average shocks, then the employment loss would be much, much lower, around 0.034%. Clearly, this is to say that this can matter also in the aggregate, and so it's actually something that it's interesting to look at. After this, I have a lot of robustness, but luckily I can just show you 2 pictures. So we do a lot of robustness. We have alternative approaches to estimate trade policy shocks. We have alternative measure of expectation. Instead of using market to book, we use price earning ratio. We have additional controls in the first stage, the growth rate of hourly earnings or imports, and so on and so forth. And as you can see, this picture is quite telling. So on the right-hand side, you have the employment response to protection is in the own industries. So it's the employment response of the protected industries. And on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you have the employment response of the downstream industries. And as you can see, our baseline results are exactly robust to all of this specification. So they are to alternative measure of upstream protectionism and alternative measure of protection such as global safeguards, or considering only those investigations which are successful. Again, you can see no effect on the own industry employment, negative and statistically significant effect on the downstream industries. So, to conclude, we estimate the dynamic effect of protections on protected industries and through production networks. We did find small, statistically non-significant and short-lived effect on industry employment, whereas we did find negative, persistent, and significant effect on employment in downstream industries. We found the loss of competitiveness contributes to these downstream industry losses, employment losses, and this is through an increase in intermediate and final producer prices. We have a lot of venues for future research, of course. One would be to dig even deeper and go to the firm level data to get a sense of the heterogeneity of within industry effect of protectionism. And perhaps another interesting thing would be to study in depth the effect of retaliation. Of course, then this could be also, I don't list here, but of course, we use the US because of obvious reason, but this data, and this is important to know, are available for many, many countries. And so also expanding this evidence to other countries could be a very interesting venue for future research. I spent now 46 minutes, so I really thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions,
Thank you very much for a very clear and interesting presentation. So let me kick off the question and answer session with my question, and then Aditya also has a question in the chat, so then he can also come in. So my question is about the broader impact of these temporary trade barriers. So for example, anti-dumping duties, there's also this externality that these duties create. So in the sense that it's not just that domestic producers, low efficiency producers are now are selling to downstream industries, but also the foreign producers have this motive to raise prices. So I wanted to see if you're capturing both of these effects, or are you capturing one of these effects and maybe the other one is is also driving some of these downstream results.
So you were not probably the referee of the paper, but the referee asked something very close to that. And so something that you'll see in the new version of the paper is that we analyze average unit import price. to see effectively what's the change in the price of the exporters, right? And there we don't find much. We don't find an effect on that. So there is this. It's consistent what also Gopinath and others have found of this, 100% pass through essentially. So with no change in the foreign price and the 1-for-1 increase in the domestic price following these tariffs. They did it for the Trump stuff, of course, but we do have some evidence with a lot of caveats. But we do have some evidence as well for the case of these 20 years.
I see. Yeah, I mean, in some other, so similarly, I mean, in line with that, there is this. So I was also talking about the unaffected exporters who have this incentive to raise prices so that they are not subject to these anti-dumping duties or countervailing duties. But I think, were you mentioning about the affected producer exporters or unaffected? Because I think this has this externality which can.
Okay, sorry. You said that those who were not subject to. Right.
Yeah.
No, that we didn't check. It's a good point, actually. Yeah, we could look at what we looked at was another side was not prices, was imports. So because they asked also that, and so we did see effectively this difference with the part of the substitution, so that you have this big decline, of course, of imports from the countries against which these measures are imposed, but you also do have a little bit of substitution with other countries. So you have an increase in the exports of other countries not affected by the TTBs in those products toward the US. And so these third country effects, as you're mentioning, for prices, which we didn't check, could be very interesting, because we did see that in quantities or in overall.
I see.
So that's a very, very good point, actually.
So, and my second question is about the measure, the tau measure does not take into account the outcome currently, right?
So the thing is that what we did, we did one of this last one was just the one that become tariffs. And then what we did were two more things. So one is actually, so what the uniform tariff equivalent is really like, because you are into this, so you know well, but there is a preliminary investigation, there is a preliminary tariff, then there is a final tariff, right? So it's very complicated. So what we did was to follow up each investigation, each tariff, when it's put, when it's not put, when it's withdrawn, etc. And we have this series, which the uniform equivalent tariff of these imports for each sector subject to TTBs. Now, if you take the change in that thing, that's a tariff measure. That's really a tariff measure, and it's only an applied tariff measure, because you can do this only for the successful initiatives, and the results go through. So you do see again this lack of effect on industry, on protected industries, and the negative effect on downstream industries. But the problem of using tariff is not so easy because of this, right? That there is each initiative can have a tariff coming in retroactive after 6 months, but then after 1 year and a half, there is a change in tariff. So which tariff are you exactly using, etc. So one other way in which we did, which is the baseline, is to say, okay, now we computed this equivalent tariff following each industry in each investigation, each month, what is put on, what is taken out, etc. And then we compute an average since elasticity, so that we can sign our shock in terms of tariff. And that's exactly what I explained very quickly, and perhaps now I hope more clearly. And that's why we can say that even if our measure is in terms of the announcement about, and it's about the share of imports, our results can be translated into tariff results.
I see.
But that's it's something that I guess you perhaps I wasn't super clear. I hope the paper is actually clearer if you read. And absolutely, if you have more questions about this, by all means, let's talk more by email or something.
Okay, great. Yeah, that would be great. Let me move on to Aditya's question. So he wrote in the chat, but I don't
good
see
point.
him in the...
Yes. So so that exactly. So the idea is precisely this, that what I mentioned, I didn't explain well, Aditya, but it's like the idea of this switching versus changing, right, of expenditure changing. So the negative impact of demand from downstream industries would be the change in the demand for them, which would be offsetting perhaps a potential positive expenditure switching type of effect. So I totally agree with that, if I understand correctly what you're saying.
I see. Yeah. Are there any other questions from the audience? Please jump in.
We are perfect timing.
So if not, then I have another question for the last 2 minutes.
Yes.
So I understand that you're doing a very, very careful exercise of identifying these shocks, but
Yes.
a layman's approach would be to just add these shock identifiers to the main equation on the right-hand side, for example. So that would be one way of controlling for these. So the coefficient on these anti-dumping or TTB measures would be the effect of the residual itself. So
that's a very good point, Shafat, and very asymmetric though. So if you were to do this for the own industry, I'm 100% with you. So it's identical. One step or two step is the same. What has become very complicated is precisely the network structure, right?
I see.
Because there you need to first combine these 8 shocks into a single upstream shock. And so there, controlling in one step, at least we were not smart enough to do it. But if you come up with an alternative way, we can do it. But you see the point, right? You see the problem. Yeah. So for the whole industry, doing in 2 step or 1 step is isomorphic. In fact, we did it, like you can do that. But we kept it in these 2 steps because for the downstream industry, you want for each downstream industry a single measure of the shock to upstream protectionism. And you do that by combining shocks. And for that, you need the 2-stage procedure.
Okay, great. So we are almost out of time, but I see that Andy has a question. So
I don't see it. So Andy,
I think there's a hand raised. So if you want to unmute and ask, please go ahead.
Andy, here you are. I don't hear.
Thank you very much. My name is Andy Xiao. Yeah. Actually, it's okay. I think it has been answered already just now. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you. It has been answered. It's a great explanation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, but thank you very much. And thank you in general to all of your institution, because of course this paper would not be there without all the effort that the World Bank put in the maintaining for many years this global anti-dumping database. And my plea is that we can use it even more now that we know that it can be used very effectively.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. I think
great.
We can end the seminar formally now. Appreciate your presentation, your agreeing to present, and thank you to all the participants. Let me also I think we have a survey link that I'll be sending in the chat in a while. So Stella, can you please send me the survey link? I cannot find it in my chat for some reason. So Stella, can you please send me the survey link for our seminar? Okay, so I think we can end with now without the survey because we're running into some technical problems. So thank you very much, Alessandro, once again, and appreciate all the participants. Thanks. Bye.
Hope to see you in Kuala Lumpur at some point in 2022.
Absolutely, yeah.
I actually applied for a conference in Singapore in March. So If
Oh.
things will be good, I'll contact you and I'll come to say hi.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. You're always welcome here.
Very good. Thank you very much, Shafat.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Take care.
And for those of you in the US, let's go and see Berrettini Djokovic at the US Open. Goodbye.
Bye.